Hello, my name is Lisa Smith and I'm a professor of criminology at the University of Leicester. And in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the Evidence Kits project, which is a project that I've been leading on for the past couple of years, working with my colleagues Mark Jobling and John Wetton in the University of Leicester's Department of Genetics and Genome Biology, and Dr. Heather Flo at the University of Birmingham. And in this project, we are really looking at innovative ways to support investigations and prosecutions of sexual violence in low-resource environments. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you a bit of a context of forensic science, specifically forensic DNA, in both domestic and international criminal investigations. And then I'll move on to the specific challenge that this project was looking to address, which is the issue of prosecuting sexual violence in what we call low-resource environments, which could include developing countries, conflict and post-conflict affected regions, remote geographic locations, and also displaced communities. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll tell you about the Evidence Kits project itself. I'll give you a little bit of background, show you some preliminary results, and move on to talk about what the next steps in the project are. So just to provide a little bit of context for forensic DNA domestically, so in the UK and in other developed countries, in 1984, Professor Alec Jeffreys discovered the technique that would become known as DNA profiling at the University of Leicester, and this discovery really revolutionized the way that the police and the courts investigate and prosecute crime domestically, because it provided an opportunity to obtain evidence that could identify individuals from biological material that is often recovered from crime scenes, including blood, saliva, and semen. In cases of violent crime, including sexual violence, DNA is often a central feature in the police forensic strategy domestically, and under the right conditions, it can make for extremely valuable evidence to identify perpetrators when a suspect has been found by the police. DNA can also provide valuable intelligence to aid investigations and prosecutions, particularly in terms of linking offences together that have been committed by the same perpetrator. And it's often forgotten, but equally important, that in addition to the value of DNA evidence in identifying guilty persons, it's also important to remember its value for exonerating the innocent. So the Innocence Project, which began in the United States, but now supports a network of innocence projects in a number of other countries, has used primarily DNA to exonerate innocent individuals post-conviction. In the US alone, the Innocence Project has successfully exonerated 362 individuals to date, including 20 who had been sentenced to the death penalty. Now, in domestic cases of sexual violence, so here I'm talking about sexual violence in the UK, although it's a similar context to other developed countries, it's notoriously difficult to investigate and prosecute, and it suffers from very low reporting rates compared to other crime types. That's not something that is specific to developed countries. That is pretty much a universal rule. In the UK, and similarly in other places, there are well-established protocols and guidelines for the collection, storage, and analysis of evidence obtained during investigations of sexual violence. The Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine in the UK outlines the collection of various sources of forensic material from both the victims and suspects, including mouth swabs and mouth rinses, fingernail clippings, urine, and external and intimate swabs. Now, these are medical examinations that are carried out by medical practitioners or specially trained nurses, and I'll come back to this issue of administering sexual assault kits by medical professionals when we talk about our kit that we've designed. Now, in recent years, there's been a real shift towards victim-centered approaches to investigating and prosecuting sexual violence, which basically means ensuring that victims can access justice and that the criminal justice system takes steps to treat victims with respect, sensitivity, and dignity in order to reduce the negative impact of secondary victimization. In the UK, we have other types of kits called early evidence kits, which are administered by police officers or other support workers, and they're really designed to maximize the opportunities to collect forensic evidence, which might be lost before a victim can undergo a full medical examination. And although best practice guidelines emphasizes that early evidence kits should be ideally used alongside full medical examinations, these kits can provide an alternative for victims who refuse an invasive medical exam on the grounds of cultural or religious reasons. And when we think about the evidential value of DNA, as I mentioned a bit earlier, it can provide very valuable evidence to prove recent sexual contact between two people. But it's also important to recognize the limitations of DNA evidence. So it can be extremely important for identifying a perpetrator when the victim can't identify them. So when the perpetrator is a stranger to the victim, identifying a link between two people or recent contact, sexual contact between two people using DNA can be extremely useful in an investigation. Less commonly, you can also use paternity testing to support historic allegations where a child has been born as a result of a sexual assault, but that is a less common technique. But when is DNA not useful? Well, in the vast majority of investigations and prosecutions of sexual violence in the UK, the perpetrator and the victim are known to one another and in fact might be already in a relationship or have gone on a date, and where the sexual contact in a case of sexual assault, in those cases, the sexual contact itself might not be the particular question to be answered in court, but it could be that consent is the primary issue. And in those cases where both parties are admitting that there was sexual contact between them, but one is saying it was consensual and one is saying it wasn't, DNA is not useful. It will not be able to answer the question of consent. Now in this graph we see some data collated by the World Health Organization in 2014, and I just want to focus on the top part of this pyramid where we can see the rapes reported to the police, which are a relatively small proportion of all rapes that are summarized in this graph. But what we can see is that that top triangle of rapes reported to the police, quite a large proportion of those are rapes committed by a stranger, so somebody not known to the victim. And as you've seen in the previous slide, those are the cases where forensic DNA has the most potential to be valuable evidence during the investigation and prosecution. Now, when we look at sexual violence in the context of low resource environments, and remember those could be conflict and post-conflict settings, developing countries, remote geographic locations, and displaced communities, for example, which are lacking in the infrastructure to respond to cases of sexual violence in as efficient a way as we do in high resource environments. What we see is very complex cultural, political, and social factors that play roles in perpetration, reporting, investigation, and prosecution of sexual violence. There's also deeply embedded gender equality, which is at the root of this issue and at the root of very high rates of perpetration of sexual violence in these contexts. But in these contexts as well, there are some significant barriers to the use of DNA evidence, and in particular to the collection of DNA evidence. There's typically a lack of access to medical facilities and trained personnel, and we've already seen that your typical sexual assault kit is administered by a trained medical practitioner or nurse. So when there's a lack of access to those facilities, DNA evidence is not able to be collected. There are cultural norms and safety issues that deter women from seeking invasive medical exams, even when they are available. And there's a general unwillingness in some of these contexts to document sexual violence, an unwillingness by doctors and nurses, an unwillingness by the police. And so that unwillingness to document sexual violence deters victims from reporting. So the research challenge that we were met with and that we were trying to overcome with the Evidence Kits project, which I'll tell you about in a moment, was to improve prosecution rates, the very low prosecution rates for sexual violence in low resource environments, and to do this through access to high quality forensic DNA evidence. So what we were really doing is starting a program of research and innovation to develop novel evidence collection methods and use these to empower women through access to evidence and encourage reporting and prosecution of these crimes, and balance the accessibility of evidence with admissibility criteria in the courts. And we also are very conscious of making sure that this program of research has synergies with existing protocols, NGO protocols or NGO practices, and international organizations involved in the documentation of sexual violence. So the Evidence Kits project, EViDENCE is an acronym for Empowering Victims Through DNA Evidence from Novel Collection and Examination Kits. And for this project, I assembled an interdisciplinary team of researchers with relevant expertise to tackle the issue, which includes criminology, genetics, psychology, and the law. And this multidisciplinary approach is absolutely crucial in this kind of project because not only do you need expertise from different disciplines, but you also need multi-sectoral partnerships. So you need governments to help identify and support legislative requirements. You need NGOs who are working on the ground in relevant regions and who have a vast experience of working directly with survivors. You need the police engaged because in many areas we may need to be changing the police approach to investigating sexual violence and training investigators how to use new techniques. It's extremely important to engage with prosecutors because we need to engage the judiciary in the development of new forensic techniques to ensure that they meet the legal requirements of evidence. Hospitals are another important partner in these projects because in regions where hospitals are accessible, we need to ensure that nurses and doctors are trained to recover forensic evidence properly. And we're also working with industry partners because anywhere where you have a new innovation that needs to be commercialized and available in various contexts, you need to work with industry to realize those outcomes. So the research aim really of this project and this preliminary data that I'll show you in a second was to test the efficacy of a novel self-examination intimate DNA swab for detecting male DNA after unprotected sexual intercourse. Our methods for this project were we had volunteer couples in the UK who engaged in consensual unprotected sexual intercourse. So these were couples who were volunteering to participate in this proof of concept study. The procedure was that following intercourse between 12 and 36 hours after unprotected intercourse, the female participants were asked to use a prototype of a self-examination swab. Participant couples returned those intimate swabs and a reference buccal swab or cheek swab from both the male and female participants. And the female participants also completed a brief questionnaire about how easy it was to use the self-examination swab, how easy it was to follow the instructions, and how comfortable it was using the swab. And these are the results of the proof of concept study of our couples who returned their swabs. So you can see the first column on the left is time since intercourse in hours. So it ranges from 12 hours to 34 hours. You can see in the second column the ratio of male to female DNA that was recovered from the swab. So in some cases there was quite a lot of male DNA relative to female DNA, where in other cases you can see ratios of 1 to 1,447 and 1 to 2,383. So that's very tiny amounts of male DNA relative to how much female DNA was on the swab. And what you can see on the far right, the profile quality, where it says FP means we managed to recover a full profile of the male's DNA. PP is partial profile, and you can see in one case 34 hours, that's the longest time since intercourse. That one we failed to recover a male DNA profile, but that was the only one that failed, and it was the longest one since intercourse. So a very positive result in terms of being able to recover the male DNA. And in terms of the design of the self-examination swab, the prototype that we used in this study was basically modeled on existing feminine hygiene products, so in this case a tampon applicator with a DNA swab inside of it. And there's a number of things that we need to consider in the design of this product. We need to ensure that the swab, when it's used, is placed properly for maximizing the chances of getting male DNA. We need to keep in mind the comfort of the user, so we want to make sure that it's comfortable to use, it's not painful to use, it's relatively easy to use. Safety concerns, we need to make sure that the swab doesn't cause any further injury or break during use, so the swab has been designed with that in mind. We need to reduce the risk of contamination, so this is a forensic issue where we want to protect the end of the swab during insertion and removal to ensure it's unlikely to be contaminated with DNA on external surfaces. And we also need to keep in mind the packaging and storage of used swabs, because remember that these are meant for low resource environments where there may not be accessible storage and particularly refrigeration, and so these have been designed in such a way that they don't require storing. They automatically dry out when they're packaged, and they're packaged in tamper-evident packaging, which enables people to be ensured that nobody has tampered with the product after it's been put in its final packaging. So in terms of next steps for the project, we need to further validate the self-examination swabs. We've done one relatively small proof of concept study, but once we have the final design sorted out, we need to do much more validation of it to make sure that it is a robust method. We need to continue to collaborate with prosecutors and the judiciary to ensure the legal admissibility of DNA collected during this technique. We need to do field testing of the kits, and we also need to come up with training programs for police and prosecutors. And all of this work is ongoing at the moment. During a recent fieldwork visit in Nairobi, we gathered views of survivor organizations, NGOs, the judiciary, police, and government forensic labs about their current practices and how the implementation of our self-examination kit might complement and improve what they're doing. And the response during this visit was very positive, and we're very confident that we'll be able to continue to work with these organizations and make the kits available to survivors in the very near future. Thank you.